In 1279, an empire stretched from the Sea of Japan to Eastern Europe. At the peak of its power, the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in history, controlled nearly a quarter of the Earth's landmass. Yet, within less than a century, it completely disintegrated. What's puzzling is that there was no single battle marking the end of this mighty empire. No burning of Rome, no defining Waterloo. The Mongol Empire's collapse occurred gradually, and history books often overlook the true cause. Today, let's explore the question: what really brought down the greatest empire of the medieval world? But before we dive into the details, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time is it right now. Drop a comment below. I'm curious to see how far this video has reached. And if you enjoy history told in an unconventional way, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell. Now, let's rewind the clock to 1227. In August of that year, Genghis Khan passed away during a campaign in China. His death marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of an existential challenge for the empire he built. He left behind an extraordinary legacy, a vast empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea, twice the size of the Roman Empire or the Islamic Caliphate at their peaks. However, Genghis also left a critical problem. How do you govern an empire that one man could conquer on horseback, but couldn't rule from the saddle? The Mongols were fundamentally nomadic people. Their culture was based on constant movement. Winters in the south, summers in the northern steppes. Their yurt homes could be packed up in an hour, and their entire way of life was designed for mobility. But now, they ruled over China, a civilization known for its complex bureaucracy. They controlled Persia, an ancient civilization with sophisticated urban centers. They dominated lands where people lived in fixed homes, farmed settled plots of land, and viewed staying in one place as a symbol of civilization. This contradiction would eventually tear the Mongol Empire apart from within. Mongol tradition dictated that the empire was a collective property of the royal family. Genghis Khan divided the lands among his 4 sons, Yochi, Chagatai, Ogade, and Talyui. However, Genghis chose Ogade to be the great Khan, the supreme ruler. Ogade was a wise choice. Unlike his brothers, he had no excessive personal ambitions and was respected by all. Under Ogade's rule, the Mongol Empire continued to expand. Mongol armies devastated Budapest in 1241, reaching deep into the heart of Europe. But in December 1241, Ogade suddenly died. His death marked the beginning of a crisis that would shake the empire to its core. The first collapse. 2 years of chaos after Ogade's death, the empire plunged into 2 years of chaos. No new great Khan was elected, and the Mongol princes withdrew their armies, competing for power. Europe, which had been on the brink of destruction, was saved not by military might, but by the internal crisis within the Mongol leadership. Eventually, Ogade's son, Gayuk, took the throne in 1246, but his reign lasted only 2 years before he too died. This succession crisis revealed a fundamental weakness in the Mongol system. When the empire relied on exceptional individuals, it was fragile. The system's inherent instability was now exposed. The rise of Mongol Khan in 1251, Mongol Khan, the son of Talyui, ascended to the throne. His reign was a significant shift from Ogade's lineage to Talyui's, and not all princes were happy about this change. Nevertheless, Mongol was a strong leader, and he managed to reunify the empire. He continued the Mongol conquests, assigning his brothers Kublai and Hulagu important tasks. Kublai was charged with completing the conquest of China, while Hulagu was ordered to march west. In 1258, Hulagu achieved a historic victory by capturing and destroying Baghdad, a city that had been the center of the Islamic world for 5 centuries. This was a significant achievement, but it came with unintended consequences. The hidden price of victory. The plague modern genetic research suggests that during their campaigns, Mongol armies inadvertently disturbed a deadly pathogen in the marmot populations of the Tian Shan Mountains. This pathogen, Yersinia pestis, is a bacterium that causes plague. The Mongols unwittingly spread the disease across Eurasia, setting the stage for the Black Death, which would go on to kill over 100 million people. But in 1259, Mongol Khan died suddenly during a campaign against the Song dynasty in China. Mongol was only about 50 years old, and he left no clear successor. This was the Mongol Empire's point of no return. The second collapse, a civil war for the throne with Mongol's death, his two brothers, Kubla and Aribok, both claimed the title of Great Khan. Kubla, stationed in China, was supported by those who wanted to continue the empire's development along sedentary lines, learning from the civilizations they had conquered. Aribok, on the other hand, was in the Mongol homeland and was supported by those who wanted to preserve the traditional nomadic way of life. This wasn't just a power struggle. It was a conflict over the very soul of the Mongol Empire. The decision between adopting a sedentary, bureaucratic model of governance and maintaining a nomadic, warrior-based lifestyle would determine the future of the Mongol Empire. This conflict wasn't just a political dispute. It represented a cultural divide between two radically different ways of life. Kublai Khan's vision ultimately prevailed. In 1271, he founded the Yuan dynasty in China, formally bringing China under Mongol rule. His focus on establishing a sedentary empire set him on a path toward transforming the Mongols into rulers of a permanent, bureaucratic empire. However, the Mongols' internal division, which began with the death of Mongke, would ultimately weaken the empire from within. The empire, which had once been unified under extraordinary individuals, now fragmented into competing factions. The Mongols had not just conquered vast lands, they had also inherited and struggled to govern complex societies. They were faced with the impossible task of ruling lands that demanded a level of stability, continuity, and bureaucracy that was foreign to their nomadic culture. The slow decline of the Mongol Empire over the next few decades, the Mongol Empire splintered further. The various khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Yuan dynasty in China, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, each pursued their own agendas, often at odds with each other. The empire had lost the unity it once had under Genghis Khan. By the mid-14th century, the empire's central authority had completely disintegrated. The final blow, the Black Death in the 1340s, the Black Death, which had been silently spreading since the time of Mongol Khan's conquest of Baghdad, ravaged the remaining Mongol territories. Entire populations were wiped out, trade networks collapsed, and the Mongol rulers, already weakened by internal strife, were unable to recover. The Mongol Empire, which had once been the most powerful force in the world, was now a shadow of its former self. The Mongol Empire, which had once stretched from the Sea of Japan to Eastern Europe, was unraveling by the mid-13th century. After Kublai Khan's victory in the civil war from 1260 to 1264, the empire had become a fractured entity. The Golden Horde in the west under Berk Khan had broken away, while Russia and Eastern Europe were now under his control. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia pursued its own ambitions, and Hulagu's Ilkhanate in Persia had their loyalties to Kublai, but the distance between them made it hard to maintain unity. By 1264, after Kublai's victory, the empire was no longer a unified force. It had divided into 4 independent states, each with its own interests, often at odds with each other. This, historians agree, marked the end of the unified Mongol Empire. The real question now was, how long would each of these khanates survive? Kublai Khan, seeing the empire's fragmentation, made a bold decision. In 1271, he declared the formation of a Yuan dynasty, a Chinese dynasty rather than a Mongol Khanate. He moved the capital from the Mongol homeland in Karakoram to Daidu, modern Beijing. For many Mongols, this was seen as a betrayal of their nomadic roots. Genghis Khan had once said, "The empire is the saddle, not a stone palace." But Kublai was now sitting in a grand Chinese palace, conducting official ceremonies in Confucian style, and relying heavily on Chinese bureaucracy to govern the empire. Kublai Khan was a capable ruler who completed the conquest of the Southern Song dynasty in 1279. He introduced new policies, including the creation of an efficient postal system, the issuance of paper currency to promote trade, and the protection of religious freedoms. He even invited scholars from across the world, including the famous Venetian explorer Marco Polo. However, Kublai made some costly mistakes, most notably his campaigns against Japan. In 1274, Kublai Khan assembled a massive fleet to invade Japan. Despite the Mongols' prowess on land, they were not skilled sailors. The invasion ended in failure when a massive storm destroyed much of the fleet. The Japanese called it the kamikaze, or divine wind. Kublai, undeterred, mounted a second campaign in 1281. This time, he sent an even larger force, 4,400 ships and 140,000 men. Again, a storm struck, sinking most of the fleet. Marco Polo recorded that the troops were caught in a violent north wind, and the ships collided, causing irreparable damage. The cost of these failed campaigns equaled the GDP of many nations. Kublai also conducted failed military campaigns in Vietnam, Burma, and Java, each draining the empire's resources without any real benefit. The problem wasn't that Kublai was a poor leader, but that an empire built on conquest couldn't survive when conquest itself slowed or became too costly. The Mongols had amassed great wealth through plunder, and when there was no one left to conquer, or when the cost of conquest became prohibitive, the empire's main source of income dried up. The tax system that had been effective on conquered peoples couldn't support the empire, especially with rampant corruption taking its toll. There was another contradiction at play. The Mongols had conquered some of the world's most advanced civilizations, China and Persia. To rule these societies, the Mongols had to adopt their institutions, but in doing so, they risked losing their own identity. Kublai tried to maintain a balance. He established two capitals, Xanadu, near the Mongol steppes, for hunting and maintaining a nomadic lifestyle, and Dadu, Beijing, for administering China. He divided the population into four classes. Mongols at the top, followed by West Asians, North Chinese, and South Chinese, who were considered the least trustworthy. Mongols were forbidden from marrying Chinese women, and Mongol women did not practice foot binding, a common Chinese tradition. However, no matter how hard the Mongols tried to maintain their distinctiveness, they were always a minority ruling over a majority of more than 100 million Chinese. In the eyes of the Chinese, the Mongols were always barbarians, and there was a simmering resentment waiting for an opportunity to overthrow their rule. The same dynamic unfolded in Persia. Initially, the Ilkhanate in Persia was brutal, destroying Baghdad and massacring its inhabitants. But over time, the Mongol rulers began adopting local customs. In 1295, Mahmud Ghazan Khan officially declared Islam the state religion of the Ilkhanate. This shift marked a significant cultural change, as the conquered peoples began to reverse conquer their Mongol overlords. Similarly, the Golden Horde in the West and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia also converted to Islam. But the Yuan dynasty in China remained rooted in Buddhism and the Mongol religion of Tengri. The Mongol khanates no longer saw each other as united brothers, but as rivals, and this religious and cultural divergence deepened the rifts between them. Now we come to the hidden reason why the Mongol Empire's collapse is often misunderstood. Most history books describe the Black Death as a natural disaster that appeared in the 1340s and spread to Europe in 1347. However, modern scientific research, especially genetic studies, has rewritten this story. The plague didn't simply appear in the 1340s. It had been moving through Eurasia much earlier, during the Mongol conquest of the 13th century. It spread along the trade routes, facilitated by the Mongol Empire's vast network, and was carried by fleas living on rodents that traveled with the Mongol armies. The Mongols, in their expansion, unintentionally spread the plague, and by the time it reached Europe, it was already a devastating force. The Black Death would go on to kill over 100 million people across Eurasia. It ravaged the Mongol territories, further weakening the khanates and accelerating their disintegration. By the mid-14th century, the Mongol Empire had fragmented into separate states with no central authority. The death toll from the plague, combined with internal power struggles, hastened its collapse. The Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, and the Yuan dynasty each faced their own challenges, and the once unified Mongol Empire was no more. The Mongols had created the largest empire in history, but their inability to adapt to governance, their overextension, and the sheer weight of the plague contributed to the empire's ultimate downfall. The collapse of the Mongol Empire is one of the most puzzling events in history. At its peak in 1279, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from the Sea of Japan to Eastern Europe, covering nearly 25% of the Earth's land mass. Yet less than a century later, it had disintegrated without a decisive battle to mark its fall. The explanation for this rapid decline is multifaceted, and the role of the Black Death is often considered a key factor. However, the plague's origins trace back to earlier Mongol campaigns, making it a crucial but unintended part of the empire's downfall. The plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, is believed to have originated in the marmot populations of the Tian Shan Mountains in Central Asia. These marmots carried fleas that were the primary vectors for the plague. The bacterium existed in a state of equilibrium in this region, occasionally infecting humans but not spreading widely. However, as the Mongol armies moved through these territories, they disrupted the local ecosystem. The massive movements of soldiers, horses, and goods created conditions that allowed the plague-carrying fleas to jump from marmots to other species, including humans. This disruption of the ecological balance is considered a key event that enabled the spread of the plague. When the Mongols conquered the Khitans in 1218 and later attacked the Tanguts in the Song dynasty, they unknowingly set the stage for a pandemic. The Big Bang of plague occurred during these campaigns, creating new genetic strains of the bacterium that would eventually lead to the Black Death. From Central Asia, the plague spread along Mongol trade routes. One early outbreak, during the siege of Kaifeng in 1232, is believed to have killed nearly 1 million people, around 40% of the city's population. Some historians argue that this was the first major plague outbreak, though it may also have been caused by famine. Westward, Hulagu Khan's campaign against Baghdad in 1258 may have carried the plague into Iraq and Iran. However, the outbreak didn't explode immediately. It spread silently, establishing plague reservoirs in different regions, only to surge in the 1330s. This was when the plague became a devastating global force, potentially triggered by factors like climate change or an earthquake. The plague began to spread rapidly in 1346 when it appeared in the trading port of Kaffa, located on the Black Sea. At the time, the port was controlled by the Genoese but situated within the territory of the Golden Horde. There is a famous, though possibly apocryphal, story that Mongol forces besieging Kaffa catapulted the bodies of plague victims into the city, intentionally infecting the Genoese defenders. Whether or not the specific event happened as described, it is clear that the plague spread from Kaffa, where Genoese ships fled with the disease, carrying it to Sicily in 1347. From there, it spread across Europe, decimating populations in its wake. The Black Death killed between 100 million and 200 million people across Eurasia, and the Mongol Empire's territories were no exception. The plague's toll on the Mongol rulers and nobility significantly weakened the military and destroyed local economies. In the Ilkhanate, which had already been weakened by internal strife, the Black Death may have hastened its collapse in 1335. Christopher Beckwith, a historian, notes that the plague killed many Mongol elites, further weakening the empire's military and economic foundation. The Mongol Empire's once vibrant intercontinental trade system, Pax Mongolica, became a highway for death. The empire's vast communication and transportation networks had allowed for the rapid spread of goods and culture, but now they facilitated the spread of disease. After the death of Kublai Khan in 1294, the Yuan dynasty in China began to weaken. The succession crisis reappeared, with 8 emperors ruling between 1308 and 1333. 2 of them were assassinated, and all died young. With no clear rule of succession, each emperor's death triggered violent power struggles, leaving the empire vulnerable at a time when it needed strong, unified leadership. The Yuan dynasty also faced internal challenges. Heavy taxes were levied to fund unsuccessful military campaigns, and corruption within the bureaucracy became rampant. Natural disasters, including flooding of the Yellow River, combined with poor agricultural policies, led to widespread famine. Disease and unrest compounded the problem, as the Chinese population grew increasingly resentful of Mongol rule. Rebellions began to erupt across China in the 1350s, with the largest being the Red Turban Rebellion. This movement combined Buddhist religious fervor with anti-Mongol nationalism, and one of its leaders, Zhu Yuanzhang, a poor peasant-turned-Buddhist monk, emerged as a prominent figure. In 1368, Zhu and his forces marched into Dadu, Beijing, the Yuan capital, and overthrew the last Yuan emperor, Togon Timur. The emperor fled to Mongolia without taking the imperial treasury, marking the end of the Yuan dynasty. Zhu Yuanzhang established the Ming dynasty, becoming the Hongwu emperor. In the west, the Ilkhanate had already collapsed in 1335, fragmenting into multiple smaller states. The Chagatai Khanate also fragmented and weakened, while the Golden Horde continued to face internal divisions and pressure from the rising power of Russia. In 1480, Ivan III of Russia refused to pay tribute to the Golden Horde, which is often seen as the final end of Mongol rule over Russia. At its peak, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous empire in history. Yet, by the 14th century, it splintered into several smaller states, and the once mighty empire was no more. The Mongols had built an empire based on conquest and plunder, but as they encountered the limits of expansion and suffered from internal strife, their empire collapsed. The reasons for the Mongol Empire's collapse are intertwined. First, the structural contradiction of a nomadic society attempting to govern sedentary civilizations eventually led to the loss of Mongol advantages. Second, the empire's excessive size made it difficult to maintain unity, especially without modern communication and transportation technologies. Third, the Mongol status as a minority ruling a vast majority of sedentary populations created deep resentment that undermined their rule. Combined with economic strains, succession crises, and the catastrophic impact of the Black Death, these factors led to the disintegration of one of history's greatest empires. The Mongols, who made up less than 2% of the population of their empire, faced a significant problem when their military strength weakened. They simply didn't have the population base to maintain power. As the empire expanded, the Mongols relied heavily on conquest to fuel their economy. When the expansion slowed and the empire stopped growing, they failed to transition to a sustainable economic system, and this lack of diversification further hastened their downfall. A major issue was the chronic succession crisis. The Mongols lacked a clear and reliable system for succession, and each new emperor's death led to civil war. This not only drained resources but also caused fragmentation within the empire, with different regions pursuing their own interests. The resulting instability further undermined Mongol rule. Additionally, the Mongols were confronted with reverse cultural assimilation. As they conquered different regions, the Mongols themselves began to adopt the cultures and religions of the peoples they had conquered. Over time, this erosion of Mongol identity destroyed the cohesion that had held the empire together. The Black Death, which most historians now recognize as a key factor in the empire's collapse, also played a devastating role. The plague killed millions, wiped out entire populations, destroyed economies, and disrupted trade. This catastrophe weakened both the rulers and the ruled, leading to further fragmentation. The empire's vast trade network, which had been one of its greatest achievements, became a conduit for the spread of disease. While the Mongols' accomplishments were unparalleled, the unintended consequences of their actions would come to haunt them. No single factor caused the collapse of the Mongol Empire. Rather, it was a combination of multiple intertwined issues. The Mongols were great warriors and conquerors, but the skills that helped them build an empire didn't translate into the ability to govern effectively. The Mongol success was built on military prowess and territorial expansion, yet when that expansion ended, they lacked the foundation needed to sustain their power. There were deep structural contradictions at play. Kublai Khan, for example, was a brilliant ruler, but he couldn't resolve the fundamental issue of governing a nomadic society over sedentary civilizations. As the Mongols adapted to rule China and Persia, they faced the difficult choice of abandoning their traditional way of life. But in doing so, they began to lose the very qualities that made them successful conquerors. This paradox, being too different from the societies they sought to rule, while too entrenched in their own traditions to adapt completely, was one of the empire's greatest weaknesses. Another lesson from the Mongols' rise and fall is that systems built around individuals are fragile. During the empire's heyday, extraordinary leaders like Genghis Khan, OGDI, and Kublai Khan kept the empire unified and expanding. But when ordinary rulers took power, the empire faltered. Effective governance requires strong institutions, not just a reliance on exceptional leaders. The Mongol Empire's inability to create such institutions contributed significantly to its fragmentation. The unintended consequences of the Mongols' expansion are another critical factor. While they built the most extensive trade network of their time, the same network also helped spread the Black Death. This highlights a major lesson for today's world, where the global interconnectedness of trade, technology, and information has similarly created new risks. From climate change to pandemics, we must be mindful of the unintended consequences of our actions. The Mongol experience also teaches us about the dangers of excessive diversification. As the Mongol khanates, such as the Ilkhanate, Golden Horde, and Chagatai Khanate, adopted different religions and cultures to better rule their local populations, they lost their unity. This shift from a shared Mongol identity to separate regional identities made it more difficult to maintain cohesion, especially when external pressures like economic decline or civil war arose. Finally, the Mongol Empire's collapse reminds us that no empire lasts forever. Throughout history, all empires, whether the Romans, the British, or the Mongols, eventually fall. The question is not if, but when and how. In the case of the Mongols, their empire collapsed due to a combination of internal contradictions, external pressures, and unforeseen factors like the Black Death. But the legacy of their empire endures. The trade routes they built connected east and west, setting the stage for the age of exploration. Their system of cultural exchange spread new ideas, technologies, and knowledge across vast regions. In Russia, China, and Persia, the Mongols helped shape the national consciousness through resistance to their rule. The Mongol story is a reminder that no power is absolute and that success is never permanent. The collapse of the Mongol Empire was not due to a single event, but rather a complex web of factors: structural contradictions, poor decisions, cultural assimilation, economic crisis, and a devastating pandemic that the Mongols themselves helped to spread. This is the truth few people talk about because it's complicated and doesn't offer a simple answer. But by understanding it, we gain a deeper insight into history, not as a narrative of heroes and villains, but as a series of choices made by people in specific circumstances, with consequences that were sometimes impossible to foresee.